And as soon as Kim has us queued up, and I just got the thumbs up, Anissa, why don't you stand with me? We're going to... Presidential primary process here in the state of Minnesota for the year 2020. This program this evening is sponsored by the League of Women Voters-Rochester and by the Rochester Public Library. My name is Jane Callahan. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters, and I will be one of your presenters tonight. And next to me is Anissa Hollingshed, city clerk, who is busy getting ready to have the preparations for the actual running of the elections in the city of Rochester. She will also help me present the PowerPoint that the State League of Women Voters has prepared. We will also hear after the PowerPoint from Mark Krupski, who works for Olmsted County and will be running the elections for the county. So with that, we will start by looking at the presentation. Now, this first slide tells us that this is really a new process for the state of Minnesota. There have been 4 previous presidential primaries, but they date 1916, 1952, 1956, and 1992. So this is really a different process for us. Voters think of that as the election as being the way that they can influence things, and we have been a caucus state, but we are now going to the presidential nominating primary. And based on the legislation that came out of the year 2016 up at the legislative, up at the state capitol, we will from now on have a 2-prong process: the presidential primary election for everyone, and then the caucuses where you can go and discuss issues, your neighborhood caucus, and nominate every other candidate for elective office.
So yes, so as Jane talked about, this is our first time doing this in Minnesota since 1992, and this is a method that we're switching to after 2016 in lieu of caucuses. So in 2016, voters who chose to go in caucus with their political party of their choice, that process was caucuses occur at one set time, usually 6 p.m. on a Tuesday, and in one place. And so what we saw around the state in 2016 was quite a lot of very busy caucuses and voters who weren't able to get in. There's no ability for absentee voting, anything like that. You had to be there Tuesday, 6 p.m. or you didn't participate. So we're doing the presidential nomination primary this year instead at the direction of the legislature, but it's really key for our voters to realize this is being administered by election administrators, but it is still a party process. So it's a partisan primary. There will be partisan ballots, and we'll talk more about that. But for our voters to understand, this is still helping the parties to select their candidates that are moving forward for the general election in November. And it's also exciting because we're doing this on March 3rd, which is Super Tuesday, which puts Minnesota voters right in the mix of all the presidential excitement. We'll talk more about early absentee voting, and that starts on Friday, which makes Minnesota voters some of the very first in the country to have a chance to actually cast a ballot towards selecting a presidential candidate this year.
And by Friday, we mean January 17th. So if you're viewing this program at another time, early balloting is probably available to you. This is not a traditional election. This is, as Anissa said, a party process that looks and feels like an election. I get a kick out of that. But it's not an election for the candidates. It's really a message to the party. Who do you think should be the nominee? And that's the key thing that voters can participate in. And we're hoping that by having a presidential primary, many people can be quickly accommodated, which was not possible in the consensus process. There are even some studies that suggest by having a presidential primary, the state that has that will increase the number of people who vote in the general election. And to the League of Women Voters, that's like catnip. We want to see increased voter turnout. But we should not confuse the presidential nominating primary, which is a party process, with an official election. Oh, goody. You get this.
All right, I get the flow chart. We're going to walk through the whole process. So as you may very well be aware, quite a few of our candidates have been in this race for quite some time already. It's quite a process to campaign for president, and so folks may have been interested months, even years ago in some instances. They've been out there campaigning. Whole campaigns have gone up and suspended already. But as they go about their business, they make aware their intention to be a candidate. They talk with their party chairs. They notify the party chairs in each state that they intend to run for office, that they want to be on the ballot. It is up to our party chairs here in Minnesota to set that presidential nomination primary ballot for each party. So each of the party chairs for the parties that are choosing to participate in this election on March 3rd needed to certify their list of candidates by December 31st to have those ballots prepared for our voters coming up here. And so once those ballots are ready, voting starts, voters get to cast their ballot. They can do that during the early absentee period that we get to gain by doing this through a process run by election administrators now instead of just the caucus, or in their polling place on the March 3rd election day from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., just like always. And so following that, the election officials that are running the elections will tabulate those results, share that information back with the party chairs, and the parties will ultimately send their delegates on to their conventions, ending in their national conventions this summer. And the delegates to those national conventions will be sent based upon the percentages of votes that candidates receive during this presidential nomination primary.
Yes, so we're going to take this, break this down. Someone decides they want to run for president. They become a candidate for president, start raising money for their campaign, and begin campaigning. And you've all seen so many of the candidates choose some wonderful setting from their home state or some other symbolic setting for starting their campaigns. But we have also seen that candidates will decide at a certain point to cease campaigning. And today, Cory Booker took that step. So one of the things to think about when you're thinking about casting a very early ballot is whether or not the candidate you will vote for on that day will still be a candidate by March 3rd. So this is going to be an equation that every voter should take into consideration because currently, if I'm not mistaken, there's no way to withdraw the ballot and recast it. Or is there, well, I'm going to refer to my expert here.
Well, I would say, Mark, cover your ears, because I know this is not a favorite thing when you're administering absentee voting. But until the final 7 days, it is actually possible to do what we colloquially call claw back your ballot. So if you do cast a ballot via absentee, starting on January 17th, you have up until that last 7 days before March 3rd, if you do change your mind, to go to the Olmsted County Elections Office and say, I need to claw back my ballot, I'm going to try it again and vote for someone else. It does have to still be within the same party, though. Anytime you're voting in this primary, once you make your party selection, you cannot change to the other party.
Thank you. I had not found that anywhere in my reading. So this is step number one, and we've seen a lot of people come into this race at different times.
All right, so as candidates are preparing to run for office, they need to make that decision for themselves which party they are going to affiliate with. Minnesota actually has 4 major political parties now. After the 2018 state general election, we added 2 additional major political parties, and if I try to say their names off the top of my head, I won't get it exactly right, but it's Legalize Cannabis Now and Grassroots Marijuana Party, I believe.
On the same issue.
Yes, so they are issue-based parties, but so we have 4 major parties in the state. Candidates can choose to run for any major or minor party in the state, but we're talking in this PMP process about major parties, and the 2 major parties that are participating in this process for us in Minnesota are the Democratic Farmer Labor, or DFL Party, and the Republican Party. So for candidates to be part of this process, they would declare for one of these parties, notify the party chair of their intention to do so. And at this stage, the DFL has put forward a ballot with 15 candidates, and the Republican Party has put forward a ballot with a single candidate.
So hence the power of the party chair. There are other candidates for the Republican nomination, but it is up to the party chair of the state of Minnesota to decide who will be on their ballot. Similarly for the Democratic side, they have chosen 15, and actually the field is a little larger. Step 3, the party chair decides which candidates, they're just what I was saying, will appear on the party's ballot for the presidential nominating primary. The chair decides if there will be a place to have write-in candidates and if voters can cast an undecided or uncommitted vote. The party chair submits the list of candidates to the Secretary of State. Election officials print the ballots.
All right, and then we get to the point where voters get to start making their choices. And so that's, as we talked about with the parties notifying the Secretary of State's office of first their intention to participate and then what would be on their ballots. That's all been done, so we are at the stage of preparing ballots. The DFL party, as I said, is putting forward 15 candidates and also giving voters the option to vote an uncommitted option, which just means that they're voting to send delegates who are not bound to any of the candidates on the ballot to the National Convention. The Republicans are sending forward a single candidate and have a write-in option. So that's what gets us to the point where voters can go out and cast their ballots, starting with early absentee voting, and that starts 46 days before every scheduled election, and that happens to be Friday, January 17th, and that will run right through Election Day. And in those final 7 days, we'll have a period of direct balloting with a couple more options of places for in-person voting that Mark will talk more about.
This is step 4, second go. Voting in the presidential nominating primary, very similar to voting in a traditional election. The difference is the presidential nominating, significant difference is that you must tell an election official which party's ballot you want to vote on. Now, you do not have to do that verbally. You can submit a written request, and most of the time you make that selection in the ballot box. Is that correct? Is that the way it's going to be in the city? Anissa, this is why we have you here.
Absolutely. So actually, we are in the middle of election judge training right now, so I've been giving the spiel a few times, so I apologize. I'm kind of skipping ahead and around because it's all in my head here, how we're talking about this. But for our voters, I'm sorry, where are we?
Saying that you must tell them which
Okay, so for
party's
selecting a ballot, you have
How
to
do you do
make that choice at the polling location. And we've designed the systems of how you do that when you go to vote in person to maintain voter privacy to the greatest extent possible. The only person in the polling place who should know which ballot a voter has selected is the ballot judge who is actually handing that ballot to them. When voters check in, we're using the poll pads for voter check-in, and the voters will be able to actually make that selection on the poll pad themselves. Unless they would like an election judge's assistance, they will make that choice themselves. The election judge helping to check them in will not even see which party that they've selected on that screen. So.
Are election judges bound to not share that information?
Would you repeat the
Yes,
question?
the question was, are election judges bound to not share that information? They are. It is classified as private data under the Minnesota Government Data Practices Act. So when the state legislature established the PNP, part of that legislation included language around the party choice and how that data is handled, and it's been classified as private. And so the only people with access to it are the election judges helping to administer the election and election administrators, and then the party chairs will receive a list of voters with which ballots they selected.
And there are issues around this question of privacy. Yes, Mary?
And is there any restriction of who the party chairs can share with?
I'm going to let you
State
answer.
law does not have the power to prescribe to them what they do with that, beyond the fact that election data can be used for political purposes.
So there are people concerned that mailing lists and mailing lists that get shared broadly may, in some ways, make this less private than the way we perceive a general election, and voters should be aware of that. And then the other sort of controversial piece of this, but this is true of every presidential primary, and think how many states have opted for that throughout the country. You must sign a statement saying you are in general agreement with the party's principles. Some people have said this is almost an oath, but not an oath. It's saying general agreement with the party's principles. Those principles are certainly bedrock kind of principles. They're not even saying party platform. They're not saying issues, specific statutes that have been proposed by that particular party or bills that have been proposed. So it's worded to be fairly general, but the purpose of this kind of statement is to keep people from going and being a spoiler in the other party's process. That has been reported in the past in presidential elections, but it's very important that we have some sort of statement and also that we have some sort of check on the system that people are not going to both parties and trying to maximize their influence. So you pick a party, you sign this statement, which is very general in nature, and then you vote in privacy.
And once that voting is done, we get to tabulate the results. And so that will happen on election night. The votes will be tabulated for each party's ballots and reported separately. So just as always on election nights, we will run results tapes, post them in the precincts, report results, and have that upload and be available right away for voters to start seeing what their fellow residents are supporting.
The Secretary of the State reports the results to the public and party chairs. And it's my understanding from my source, Mary Jones, that Secretary of State Steve Simon will probably be reporting the results to both party chairs, or that results will be shared with both party chairs. And of course, this is the point at which you start to influence the election. Not only that you are sending delegates, but the media will cover how did Minnesota vote, who's ahead, who's behind, how many people chose to go to this party or that party. So those kinds of pieces of information make us a part of this incredible Super Tuesday, March the 3rd. And if people want to have their voice heard, this is one way to do it.
And so as we've talked about delegates, for anyone who is familiar with the caucus process, part of what you do at the caucus is elect individuals to move forward to district, state, and eventually national conventions. And so this summer, both of these major parties will be holding their national conventions, and that's when they nominate officially their candidate for president to keep moving forward. And it's the delegates who are elected through the caucus process who do that voting. And in participating in the primary process this year, the major parties have agreed to have the delegates bound by the results of this primary. So that is a difference from 1992, the last time Minnesota tried a presidential primary, because that was not a binding primary. So this is really kind of some uncharted territory for us as a state to see how our voters choose to engage in this process, knowing that it has significance and will definitely impact these parties' process in selecting their candidates.
And speaking of 1992 and the rationale, I'm going to call to the microphone a resource for us, the former lobbyist for Olmsted County, Amy Cockett, who was present in the state capitol in 2016 when this legislation was passed. And one of the main things that they wanted to do was to make it different than the 92 presidential primary.
Our legislators were, of course, weighing the wishes of their constituents. People after 2008, and especially after 2016, were very upset by how hard it was to get into the caucuses. If you remember, if you attended those, some people didn't even get in because there wasn't enough parking. The Democrat and Republican parties in Minnesota just were not ready for the inundation of the people that came. So people who wanted to take part were not part of it. So there was a demand for doing it differently. Let's have primaries. Well, the political parties were not willing to accept the results of any primary in which they could not be certain that the participants were members of their own party. And as you know, primaries in Minnesota are open primaries. You get one ballot, and as long as you stay on one side, you can be a Republican one year and a Democrat another year, and nobody has to know. Well, neither of the Democrat or Republican national parties would accept the outcome of this primary if we didn't have a way to control that just Democrats were voting on the Democratic primary and Republicans on the Republican side. And so that is why there will be a Republican ballot and a Democratic ballot, and you just get one. And the fact of which one you pick will be known to the chairs of the political parties. That was the deal that was struck. But I'm fairly sure that just as people were very upset in 2008, 2012, and 2016 when they could not get into the caucuses, an equal number of people will be upset when they find out that somebody is going to know what political party's primary they are participating in. So this is probably not over, and there may be some tinkering after this election.
Great. Did we discuss step 8 here? Each party announced a nominee based on how delegates voted at the party's national convention. And of course, the national convention is beyond the control of things that happen in the state of Minnesota, and there are still pundits who think there's going to be a brokered national convention. So it's an exciting year, but it's also a year for Minnesota to learn about presidential primaries, as Amy Cockett has said, and we will learn from this experience, and there can be reforms and changes to the legislation as needed. And they're certainly going to be soliciting input from people like Anissa Hollingshed and Mark Krupski. How can we do it better? How can we do it easier for the public next time? Because the whole purpose of this is to make it easy for the public's voice to be heard on who they prefer for their national presidential nominees. Question from the floor. Yes.
Could you speak a little bit more about the impact of the binding primary? Like, what does that really drive?
And I don't, I'm going to refer back to Anissa, but the point is that you will only be able to cast one ballot. That ballot will be counted and sent to the party chair. So the previous, in 1992, the presidential primary, and my information comes from Amy, was not binding on the parties at all. So it was just sort of a beauty pageant. Just, oh, who's ahead now? It had no tie-in with the political parties. So when we say it's a binding presidential primary, the parties are buying into that. They're not going to decide their delegates' loyalty through any other process than the presidential primary process. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you for that. And did I repeat the question? It's how do we know that what is the difference between a binding presidential primary and a presidential primary, which is just a testing of public opinion and really pretty much a poll, isn't it? And that's the way it was in '92. Anna.
Is that like when they go, and I have a very shallow understanding of this, but is that when they
conventions have been different over the years. And so sometimes it's going to be up to the parties, how long are these candidates, or are these delegates bound by who they initially represented? And it's going to be a lot of horse trading by the time we decide we're going to release all of the delegates. If they cannot come to agreement, there generally comes a tipping point at this type of convention where the rules are thrown out and people are making new coalitions. So that could still happen because the conventions are under the control of the private political parties. Would you agree with that, Anissa? Did I get anything wrong?
No, you got it right on.
Okay, then we'll go forward here. Oh, and this is your slide.
So we talked about how the primary is taking the place of the caucus for the selection of candidates and the tie with the delegates going towards specific candidates. There will still be party caucuses. It's up to the parties to decide that and determine that. And I believe that both of the major parties participating in the PNP will also be holding their caucuses, I think, on February 25th this year. And at the caucuses, then, they will still be working on their party platforms, electing those delegates, supporting candidates for other offices besides president to move forward. But the presidential voting will occur through the primary process this year. This was an interesting question to me because it asked, do I have to be 18 to vote in the presidential nominating primary? It seems like an easy answer, yes, and that's the right answer. But if you may recall, for caucuses, you can caucus if you will be 18 by November. So that is not the case for the PNP. You do need to be 18 on March 3rd. So that is different than with caucuses, because I recall my very first caucus at the age of 17, the spring of my senior year of high school, and getting to start that process. But yes, Mary.
Not only does they have to be 18, they have to register to vote too, correct?
Yes, so the question was, do voters also have to be registered to vote? So because this primary is being administered by election administrators, it follows all of the regular rules of election administration. That's what allows us to offer the early absentee voting, but voters do have to be registered. But as always in Minnesota, you always have that option for same-day registration with the appropriate proofs of identification and residence. So, all right.
And I think we should stress that caucuses are the neighborhood party, so even though people under the age of 18 cannot vote, if they show up, they will likely be given voice. So you can participate in the discussions that go on there, and those discussions are pretty important. The caucuses in Minnesota have been the place where many, many ideas came forward, and one of the most famous one that's always quoted is that the Peace Corps was first proposed up in Duluth in a party caucus here in our state of Minnesota, something we're very proud of. What information about you is shared with others if you vote? Here is this controversial question we've been talking about a little bit. Election officials do not make your party preference public. And Anissa referred to that this is an ironclad rule. This has to do with, there's legal precedent for that. However, the law requires, I'm going to read this very carefully, the state to share your party preference with the chairs of the major political parties. This is because the political parties need to know who voted in the presidential nominating primaries. It's a party process, not a public election. And that's the next line. Remember, the presidential nominating primary is a political party process, not a traditional election. Typically, the parties use this information to build voter contact lists for campaign purposes. And that is the controversy, that these lists can be shared widely, and it may be that in the future there will be more regulations around that piece. How you voted, such as the candidate you voted for, or if you submitted a write-in candidate or an uncommitted ballot, will not be public information and will not be shared with the party chairs. All they know is which of the two that are being allowed this year, the DFL and the Republican parties, which of those two ballots you got, not how you voted when you got the ballot. So that will remain secret and does fulfill that sort of privacy issue that so many people are concerned about.
All right, so Election officials will not be sharing that voter's party information with anyone. Only the Secretary of State's office and making it available to those party chairs. The Secretary of State's office talks a little bit about how the Secretary of State has interpreted that to mean that they will share all of the lists with all of the party chairs. The DFL chair, it has interpreted that to mean that the major party chairs will receive the names of voters who prefer that specific party. So there is some discussion of some litigation around this. But at this point, barring a court order to the contrary, the best information that we have to share with voters about what to anticipate with this is that the Secretary of State will be sharing the information about who votes and which party they select with all of the major party chairs. I made it stop.
And that is our last slide from the League of Women Voters. So at this point, I want to turn to the second half of our program, and that is to allow first Anissa Hollingshed and then Mark Krupski to talk about how are we going to do this here in our own locality.
Thank you. So I'll just talk really briefly about how for us in Minnesota, we've talked about how voters will need to make their selection of a party in order to receive a ballot, and how that is something different for our voters. So that's a big part of our messaging and preparation ahead of Election Day, because we want to make sure that when voters arrive at their polling place, they're not surprised to the greatest extent possible that they have that kind of heads up, that that's part of this process, that this is a party process and not a typical traditional election, helping them be aware of that. You know, we have a long history of electoral engagement in Minnesota, and we really want to be able to build on that. That's a huge part of what the work that we do in my office that we're really trying to help encourage. We have an excellent framework of election laws by and large in Minnesota that really help to benefit our voter turnout. We have some of the highest voter turnout in the nation year after year. We went through a little phase where we dipped out of #1, and the Secretary of State was very disappointed by that, but we've managed to get back up there in the top spot again in the most recent election. So we're trying to maintain that. And you know, our framework of laws is a big part of that. So for instance, in Minnesota, we do have same-day registration. You have the opportunity to pre-register in advance, and that stops 20 days before an election. But unlike many states, you can still go to your polling place on Election Day and get registered right there. And that really is a huge asset to helping our voters get registered and cast a ballot year after year. We have usually extraordinarily high turnout and have that advantage as a huge part of that. We've had same-day registration since 1974 in Minnesota, so it's a long history. And sometimes when I go to national elections events and conferences, folks from other states will say, oh my gosh, how can you do that? Because we also don't have provisional ballots in Minnesota, which is the case in most other states. But back in 2002, when the Help America Vote Act passed and provisional ballots were required by many states, Minnesota was exempted because of our long and successful history with same-day registration. That essentially eliminated the need for provisional ballots. Yes, Jane. So to register, when you're voting, you need to bring proof of identification and residence. And you can meet that in multiple ways. For the largest majority of our voters, that's going to just be a state driver's license or state ID card with your current address. So if you've got one of those, you're set. You can come in, get registered, and we can get you set up and ready to vote that day. If you've just recently moved, you can even go to the DMV or Driver's License Bureau and change your address and bring that yellow slip and use that to register on Election Day. If you have an old ID that's perhaps expired or with an old address, even from another state, you can bring that with you along with an accepted bill type. And there's a list, and it's a pretty comprehensive list. Most utility bills, credit card statements, rent, mortgage, dated within 30 days of the date of election, and pair that with your photo ID to get registered then. We have options in Minnesota as well for voters who may not be able to meet one of those standards. We do something called vouching in Minnesota. So another registered voter that's in your same precinct who is familiar with, knows you, knows where you live, can come with you to your polling place and vouch for you to get you registered that same day. So we make sure in election judge training, I just came from a new judge training this afternoon, that our judges are familiar with all of those options and remember that it is their mission on election day to help every eligible voter legally cast a ballot if at all possible. So we want them to be prepared and have all that information to do so. So that's a huge part of our preparation, is getting our judges ready, our partners ready, and just sharing information generally so that everyone is prepared for election day. Yes, Jane?
Will the polling places be the same as for the general election?
Yes. The question was, will the polling places be the same as for the general election? When we set our polling places, we set them for the entire year. So we'll have 3 election events in 2020, the March 3rd presidential primary, the August 11th state and local primary, and the November 3rd general election. And we'll be using all of the same polling locations for each of those election events. So consistency is a big part of elections to help our voters be prepared, know what to expect, know where to go, what to do, all of those things. So coming up and preparing for 2020, we've really been focused, we've worked closely with the county, and I know Mark is going to talk more about that, to make sure that we're collaborating on the messaging that we're preparing. Our communications teams are working together to make sure that we're amplifying all of these key messages that voters need to get through as many sources as possible, because we want to make sure that our residents are well supported and that every eligible voter who wants to cast a ballot finds themselves election ready and gets out there at the time and place that works for them. So I'll let Mark go ahead and talk more about the specific preps that have been happening.
And I just want to state that this is Mark Krupski from Olmsted County. Thank you, Mark. We want to hear what's going to happen in the county.
Good evening, folks. Thank you, Jane, for inviting me. I'm Mark Krupski. I'm the Director of Property Records and Licensing for Olmsted County. And elections are a huge undertaking, and the city being the largest population base of the election have a tremendous role in it also, and we couldn't do better than Anissa with her background and her passion for elections, and we're lucky to have her. So talking about preparations, we began really preparing in 2018 for this election with the budget process. There were a lot of needs for technology. About half the state are working with electronic poll pads for voter registration when voters come in, and so we're getting on board with that. We've used that equipment quite a bit now. We did our first time, we did a pilot with 2 different vendors with our township elections in 2017, and the ones that they like best is the one we went with, which is a company called No Ink, and it'll follow in a minute. On one of the slides. So again, using that, in fact, why don't I see if I get to that. Okay, so right here, this is just kind of a calendar, and it overlays a lot of the duties that we have. And then also we look at the staffing needs for this. Staffing for an election is tremendous. It's just huge. When we think about it, more and more people are voting absentee. Why? They like it. It's convenient. Some people call it early voting, but in Minnesota, it's really technically absentee voting. There's 2 types of absentee votings, or 2 different periods of time. There's the period right up until that last week before the election, and then it's direct balloting absentee voting. And the significant difference in that is everything up to that week are ballots submitted in an envelope, a secrecy envelope. Then the secrecy envelope is submitted in another envelope that is witnessed and documented as such, and then that gets put in another envelope that's mailed to us, or another envelope that if you come in person, then it's just that envelope. And these all get filed away by precinct. Then come 5 p.m. on the Tuesday before election, but we probably won't do it till Wednesday morning. We have, I don't know, I want to say in 18, we probably had 11, 12,000 envelopes to open. I'll tell you, that's a very, very big job to go through those, organize those, sort through those, and open them. And we really spend from that Wednesday pretty much up until Tuesday night processing those. We have a huge central processor. And so that's a bulk of our absentee voters. Then we have the direct balloting where folks come in, they actually fill out the ballots right there, and then they're able to put it in to our optical scan tabulator equipment. But when it goes into that machine, we don't hit total. We never do that until 8 p.m. on election night. So the results of that voting for that whole week are kind of held in suspense. And so that's the main difference. And we had about 5,000 of those in 16 and again in 2018. And the voter turnout in the city of Rochester, as Anissa has shared with us, is about 27% of the votes cast were done absentee. Overall in the county, it was 25%. So our workload, if you compare that back to 2008, we probably did about 9–10% of the absentee voters voted absentee. So that's a significant change in our workload. And if people become more and more interested in voting and they like voting early, we're going to see our numbers go up. So that makes a big difference in how we staff for elections. With that, this year we have a presidential primary that's on March 3rd. I remember February 24th last year. It wasn't very far away. And the first time I've lived here 30 years, we closed Highway 52. I remember this vividly because I was coming back from Hawaii and I was in California, and my daughter went into labor with my very first grandson, and I was like, gosh, I gotta get there. And I got to Minneapolis, and then I sat there till 5, couldn't get a shuttle, and then I rented a 4-wheel drive, and let's go. And my wife, rather reluctantly, went with her crazy husband, but somehow we made it down, and I was holding my grandson a half hour after he was born. So, now, you think of that story, what could happen on March 3rd? So, maybe that's an idea that, you know, if you're worried about weather, you vote early. So that's another contributing factor that might increase our workload a little bit. So I'm not going to get into all of this. Just suffice it to say, there's a lot of milestones and a lot of dates, and I'll keep going here. And so the staffing plan. Heather Bessler would do a better job with this. Heather went and got a certificate, graduate level, master's level certificate in elections, the only one of its kind through the Humphrey School of Government. And for her capstone project, she chose staffing for an election for absentee voting. And she chose Olmsted County, of all things, which we were delighted. And they used MIT queuing theory and so forth, and national standards that a voter should not have to wait more than 30 minutes to vote. And because they get discouraged maybe, or maybe they got to do something else. And with absentee voting, the last week before election, during that direct balloting period, I don't know, as humans, we tend to kind of say, well, I'm going to get it done, I'm going to get it done. And we get a lot of people those last few days, and particularly the Thursday, the Friday, the Saturday before the general election, and that Monday, we've had hour and a half waits in line. But this year, something new and again, we want to improve the voter experience with accessibility, dependability, efficiency, and accuracy. So in partnership with the City of Rochester, we will be offering 2 what we'd call pop-up locations for absentee voting for all 3 elections. That's just during that direct balloting period. So with that said, there will be a location at the Government Center in one of our conference rooms for absentee voting. This is terrific for the folks downtown that use the Skyways and maybe live in some of our senior assisted living facilities. And for others, if you're working at Mayo Clinic and you want to vote on your lunch break or whatever it is, you can come here. We're also going to have voting at the 4-H building. We used to have it in the 1421 building, which is over on the Fairgrounds, Grand Park, site. But we moved just the voting because we're still a little concerned if we get a line and it's March or it's cold, we don't want a lot of people standing outside. So the 4-H building, we can certainly queue them up in there a lot better. So we're moving for just this election to the 4-H building. So with that said, the second pop-up location is going to be at 125 Live. And so that's another spot that folks can go to vote. And this will be during the last week before the election. And that's February 25th, the day after my grandson's birthday, through March 2nd. And so those are some things to keep in mind. And but again, those things take staffing. We need I've been out recruiting a little bit and to get 10 election judges just to work that week from that Tuesday, the 25th, through the March 2nd. And we're figuring those folks will put in about 60 to 70 hours, and but it'll be just kind of a short duration, but a very intensive duration for the voting, and we'll have our staff there as well. So this is new. So we're investing more money into the elections, but it's important that people have access, and it's important that we don't have these huge lines. And I see a hand up.
I was just wondering, in the future, if absentee voting increases, do you think that on election day, you might actually consolidate and not have a polling in every precinct?
That's a wonderful question, and I'm going to, since I don't, actually that's more of a city function or township or the small cities, they decide the polling location. That's kind of the difference, like in some of our duties. So NISA has the monumental job of lining up, 54 precincts, is it? 52 precincts. So and everybody heard the question about will we consolidate? I'll restate it for the camera. So the question, if I get it correct, is with the advent of increased absentee voting, will we consolidate election day polling locations to fewer sites to compensate for that? Is that about right? Okay.
Thanks, Mark. So I would say it's a possibility, but it is also something that would be looking for some state legislative action, and that may be something that's coming down the line at some point. We've been operating since 2010 at the state level, where we've had governors who have asked to have bipartisan consensus on any elections law changes coming through. And that's because we really want to ensure as a state that we're doing things that there is consensus on and agreement on, and not in a partisan manner. And so some of these changes around absentee voting and early voting and kind of expanding that, I think that we will eventually see more shifts that will make a further shift towards a true early voting period that is more than just the 7-day direct balloting period coming, but we do need some legislative help to make that happen. And for our polling locations right now, we have some constraints because we did take a look at this ahead of 2020 as to whether we were going to consolidate locations already, but we have to keep our polling locations within a mile of the precinct boundaries. And so as long as we have those constrictions in place, we can't move towards more of a vote center model. But I do foresee a future where as a state we start shifting towards more of that vote center model, and I think that would be a good move for our voters and make it easier for us to provide a really positive experience in all of those voting locations, whether voters choose to vote during the absentee or early period or on election day.
Thank you, Anissa. Oh, another question? Oh, 10 minutes. 10 minutes, okay. Let's see. Big year coming up, 2020. I mentioned the pop-up locations. I think that's just really a terrific addition for this election year, and as far as access and so forth. And it won't surprise me if we reach 33%. I wouldn't doubt it for the portion of the votes cast absentee. So a lot of that's self-explanatory. 1 week before the Tuesday is where we do the direct balloting. We have the 2 locations, the Government Center and 125 Live. We have the dates of the election. So that's just some general information there. Again, I think there's about 14 states on Super Tuesday or in that vicinity. So we're going to be part of Super Tuesday now. So that's wonderful. And let's see, next. So this I do want to touch on a little bit because this is a big deal for us in managing these pop-up locations. This is what's called a ballot on demand system. And what it'll do is when you think about it, a lot of times we have, like there'll be a separate ballot for each precinct, okay? Even though the ballots for this presidential primary are the same, each one, if you get the wrong precinct, they want to have all those numbers because they like to see how people voted in each precinct. So if somebody gets the wrong ballot, sometimes those get disqualified because it's an error made by an election judge. So hopefully this will reduce that risk of that happening because we're not stocking 100 different ballot styles. We're just printing them with programming. So all this machine does is print your ballot. So the process that Anissa was talking about was, when somebody comes in to get a ballot, whether it's absentee or at the polling site, they'll either fill out a roster. Absentee, we're not allowed to use the e-poll pads for absentee voting yet. That legislation for that new technology hasn't caught up with us yet, legislation-wise. But you get, once you sign in, and whether you're registered or whatever, or registering that day, you get a ballot receipt. And that ballot receipt would say Republican or Democrat. So then you take that over to the ballot judge, and they will give you the ballot. And all the ballots, even though we have like 15 names and uncommitted on one, you could probably go with a smaller ballot on the other party because there's only one name. They're both the same size because we don't want to let anybody see, oh, I know they're voting that way because they got the little ballot. So they'll both be the same size. And when you get it, you can just show the receipt. So it doesn't even have to be spoken, and the judges are trained not to reveal that, and then when the receipt goes down, they turn it over so that nobody sees that. Then you get your ballot, go vote, and then put it in the tabulator or in an envelope, depending on what point, if you're in direct balloting or whatever. So this is a new investment for us. We bought 4 of them. We'll have one at each location. We'll have one in our central office for mailing out ballots, and then we'll also have one at the 4-H building. So the other thing we want to talk about is this poll pad. All this stuff is great, but it takes lots of training. And Anissa can tell you, I think we're having about 26 trainings or more. So those are an hour each. That's 260 hours of training. And then on this electronic poll pad, we do a 2-hour training. And so that right there, you figure that one out, that's like 520 hours of training. There's a lot of work goes into training. But the good news with this is, like, you look at this fella here, he's searching through the roster for your name, and then sometimes, you might see your neighbors, they're trying to keep it all private. That won't happen here. I mean, look at how happy she is with the no-ink poll pad. You can just tell we're in a new world. And so anyway, so we bought these machines. We have 229 of them. And so we're doing a lot of training on the election judge, but this will pay off. There's a return on investment on this for the taxpayers. And what it is with these machines, after the elections, we typically have, we've had like 2,700 or I forget how many, but quite a few I think we've been as high as like 8,000 same-day registrants. Could be just somebody moved across town or whatever. Well, you're reading this registration card, and sometimes it's hard to read stuff, so errors get made in the SVRS system. And all that. Well, these machines, they can either read, if one's willing to show their driver's license, they can read the barcode, or it gets typed in by the person doing it themselves. So hopefully we get a lot of accuracy. Plus, that 6 weeks, there's a 6-week window that we must, by state law, get all the voter registration, all the roster, all that information in. Now, this stuff can be uploaded electronically. So that makes our world post-election day a lot easier. It's a lot, and so we're going to save that money that we spent on the staff doing that work. Yes, Mary?
I've heard from election judges from the referendum in November that some polling places ask people for their IDs to put on the poll pads rather than do the first three letters and my first and last name. Has that been come to your attention? And is, because we're not sure what the thing that can be confused with that, what do you?
Okay, so the question is, some judges ask for IDs during the school referendum. And if a person is a registered voter, they do not need to show their ID at all, okay? And the election judge is not allowed to ask for that ID, okay? That's not allowed. Now, some people go up and they just volunteer to share their ID. That's up to the individual. They can do that, but we cannot ask for an ID. We're not an ID state. However, that's for people that are registered. Everybody that registers has to either be vouched for or has to be identified. And, you know, there's a lot of misconception around this, but once you're in, you know, and you register, all those names, the driver's license, the social security number, whatever people give, those are all cross-checked by the Secretary of State's office. They're cross-checked with the Department of Corrections. So there is a vetting process that actually goes on. It's just that if you're a registered voter and it's election day and you go to your polling site, you do not have to show an ID. So that's not allowed. So I hope that clarifies that for you, Mary.
Yeah, and also that, to reiterate that in the training.
Oh, yes, that is covered on every single training, and I know from both Heather and what she shared to me about the trainings, I haven't been at all of them, that Anissa and Heather both have taken a very stern, staunch, firm approach to that. So, yes, sir.
But just so you're aware, they were asking for IDs. It wasn't voluntarily. They were asking.
Well, what should happen in the case, so being told that, and I'm running out of time, but if there was an ID asked for, then this can go on an incident log. Now, you can either talk to the head judge and say, hey, they're doing this, they're not allowed to do it. You can come and fill out a complaint form, and we would investigate it. Certainly make us aware, because we would go out. Now, that particular election, we helped administer, but that was the school election, not a county election, but we did assist them in some of the work.
Would there be any reason not to have signage to the effect that you do not have to show ID?
So the question is could we have signed and say you do not have to ID? I'll take that under advisement, because if somebody's the same day registrant, they would need to show proof of ID of who they are, and if it's not on ID, proof of residence, as in the case of my driver's license identifies me, but I moved recently, and I need to show that I live at X address, so that I'd have a recent utility bill. So, but good point.
You could read that while you're standing in line.
Yes, you could. So I'll bring that suggestion back. So thank you. Let me see if I have anything else here. This is just the layout. I'll just very briefly. Elections, we've been at the 1421 building since the 2012 election. We're moving. We kind of outgrew that building fairly quickly. And so we're moving out to 2122 Campus Drive in June. So the primary this summer and the general election, that work will be out there. Well, that is the current home of the City of Rochester's Building Safety Department. They're moving. Then we'll be doing some remodeling. And so this is just a schematic of that. And this is the 4-H building. Just to give you an idea, you can see you come in the main entrance. We have a large queuing area and registration area. So this will allow us to get people out of the cold and get them in line to vote. So hopefully it'll be pleasant as far as temperature goes. Amy, you had a question?
The 4-H building is for now, and the Public Works building is for next fall.
For the, August and the fall. Yes, going forward. Thank you very much. So.
Great, that concludes our discussion of the presidential primary for Minnesota for the year of 2020, an exciting new time. Our thanks to the Rochester Public Library, to Anissa Hollingshed, to Mark Krupski, and to all of you for coming. Thank you and good night.